Hi everybody, my name is Trisha and my presentation will be on the symbolism in Bernini's Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, so let's just jump right in. Commissioned by Cardinal Federico Cornaro as part of his burial chapel, Bernini created the sculpture as the focal point of his entire creation, the Cornaro Chapel. Before I go in depth with the sculpture, you may notice how beautiful the chapel itself is, and you may also see Bernini's other works of art, the Cornaro family, watching the scene from the sides of the chapel. This in itself is symbolic. They were placed above the viewer as a form of subtle promotion for the family. They are closer to witness the scene, but it is the viewer who has the better vantage point. Now on to the sculpture itself. It is a life-size structure made completely of white marble and is located in Santa Maria della Vittoria Church in Rome. It is meant to be a literal representation of Saint Teresa's own words on her moment of religious ecstasy. It is comprised of four major pieces: the angel, Saint Teresa, the cloud they are on, and the rays of light illuminating them. To begin with, there is the angel, who is perhaps the most symbolic of the four pieces. In her own words, Saint Teresa says, "He was not tall, but short, and very beautiful. He was said to pierce her very heart with an arrow tipped with fire." So inflamed by the intense pain and sweetness of it all, Saint Teresa moaned in her ecstasy. In this instance, the arrow is symbolic of God's great love. But let's not forget who is doing the piercing. The angel himself is symbolic of the heavens and the divine, as well as the spiritual nature of everything. Keep in mind that this is a vision of Saint Teresa's. This is not a physical experience, but a spiritual one, felt in the soul, a place where we cannot bear witness. Now this should be the point where I move on to the second piece of the sculpture, but I feel it necessary to inform you of the actual subject, Saint Teresa herself, so that you can fully understand why it is that a nun is displayed in such a strange and provocative manner, especially by a man such as Bernini, who was himself a devout Catholic. Born in the province of Avila, Spain, Teresa de Cepeda y Ahumada was raised practically from birth to be a pious Christian by her mother, Beatriz. Teresa herself was very interested in the lives of saints, and at the age of 7 even convinced her brother, Rodrigo, to run away with her so that they may find martyrdom among the Moors. Upon her mother's death, 14-year-old Teresa's life took a turn for the worse until she was eventually sent for her education to the Augustinian nuns at Avila. It was there in the monastery that Teresa fell into illness, and during said illness experienced many mystic moments of religious ecstasy, including that of this presentation's subject. These visions lasted for 2 years and helped Teresa to fully grasp the great evil that is sin, as well as the need to devote oneself completely to God. Her vision involving the spear-wielding angel would influence Saint Teresa for the rest of her life, as she spent the remainder of it imitating the life and suffering of Jesus Christ. Here in the sculpture, Saint Teresa is shown with quite the expression on her face. You would almost think the ecstasy she spoke of was one of a physical pleasure rather than the spiritual one she felt in her soul. However, Bernini did this intentionally as a metaphor for spiritual pleasure, since we as spectators cannot look into her soul to understand. The heart-piercing arrow combined with Saint Teresa's great ecstasy is a prime example of bridal mysticism, which is essentially a marriage with Jesus. But don't take it the wrong way, it's not as crazy as it sounds. It is actually a symbolic union with God, which is what Teresa believed in and what Bernini attempted to convey in this sculpture. Moving on from Saint Teresa, we can now look at the cloud on which she sits during this entire ordeal. Clouds are usually thought of when people attempt to imagine what heaven looks like. Perhaps this is what Bernini meant the cloud to symbolize, but I think he meant it as a way to inform of this sculpture's break with reality. Once again, it is not a literal experience, but something that has occurred in a vision, or even a dream. Now we can look at the rays of light hitting the rest of the sculpture. Upon first glance, you may think that the light is somehow magically coming from the sculpture itself, but do not be alarmed. This is actually a very cunning trick with the use of a hidden window. Bernini was quite the showman, at least with this work of art he was. The lights, as you may have already guessed, are symbols of heaven and of God's love shining down upon the sculpture's subjects. I believe it is also meant to convey Saint Teresa's emotions at this point in time, the lights representing her great joy and ecstasy, as well as her spiritual transcendence and decision to follow on in God's footsteps. Overall, the sculpture itself portrays the beautiful scene of symbolism described by Saint Teresa. Bernini did an excellent job creating a physical image to the saint's words, especially since she described the encounter with such erotic passion. It is quite understandable that some people may think of this sculpture and its inspiration as a mockery of being a pious Christian, but remember everybody, Bernini was a religious man himself. Perhaps this sculpture can be better understood if one can understand the style in which it was created, the Baroque art style. The style gained prominence in a time of severe religious turmoil. In response to the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church had heavily encouraged its use to show themes of religion in an almost tangible and emotional form. The Baroque style was meant to be big, grand, and dramatic, and more importantly, this should all be easily understood to the spectator. Bernini clearly mastered this with the entire Cornaro Chapel, the men watching from the stands, the light from heavens raining down on the angel and Saint Teresa, her expression of intense ecstasy. These are all clearly evident from the get-go. Actually, let us go back for a moment to the men in the stands and their significance. Remember how I stated the Cornaro family had this done as a form of subtle promotion? This was actually a very popular thing across the aristocracy world. The Baroque style appealed to them as a way of expressing their superiority with their impressive wealth and status. In conclusion, Bernini really brought this style to the spotlight, no pun intended, with the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. He really could not go wrong with it. Everything from the clothes to the facial expressions to the sunlight hitting their faces clearly conveys what he wanted to even the most simple-minded viewer, a woman of faith experiencing a moment of enlightenment and feeling her God's love throughout her very being. Thank you for watching this video, and should you ever get the chance, I would greatly encourage you to witness this sculpture in all its glory. Although I myself have never seen it up close and personal, I imagine it to be quite the thing to see. And who knows, perhaps you may also experience your own spiritual transcendence right there with Saint Teresa and her angel.